Okay, this one is another podcast we're going to go over. It kind of still delves into the MMT thing, but it goes into kind of a different light. And it's about productive spending versus non productive spending, private versus public spending. This is basically going on the idea of where spending is best suited. And I've had discussions over this, and MMT supporters still think that the economy is best suited with a bunch of government spending. And if you look at MMT, and they still think it's their model support human nature, which it doesn't, because the only way to support human nature in your economic model would be to eliminate central banking and to have the market use their control the actual system. It doesn't. It actually uses a more robust central banking. That's actually how the only way it actually works. This is actually the major thing with them, and this is one thing people should realize first. And when we're talking about this major factor, is this is where we get to the idea of productive versus non-productive spending. Is they believe in the ideas of public spending as they think it's a great thing. But when you got public spending, you need to realize that it doesn't go towards anything. They will not put limits on their budget. This is just a fact. And they will naturally go over budget on everything because there is no incentive for it. There's no profit incentive. There's no incentive to cut back. And the major objective is just make sure that they basically finish their goal. And when that's your objective, a lot of money is going to be wasted, and you're basically going to use more resources than is actually necessary. You're going to take as many resources as possible because there's not going to be any person that's going to tell you no. Because when you're dealing with a government, there's going to be no side that's going to say no, you can't have that because because we're not going to allow that for money. Because in many cases, you're basically rewarded for the more money you spend, and that's the way government ends up working, and that's the whole problem. So what ends up happening is you end up getting, since you're rewarded for the more money you spend, it becomes that it's this non-productive. It's non-productive in itself, and you end up being you'll basically, if a job takes 3 people to finish, you'll in, like, let's say a week with it, you'll send 20 people out there because you say, well, hey, I have what it called, hey, we have 20 people sitting here. And it doesn't matter that it costs the budget a lot more money. And this is the whole point. This is how government spending works. And it's non-productive because if we're an actual business, the business would basically say, we're only going to send 3 people out there because this is all it takes to accomplish this goal. And people need to understand this. And that's why they're viewed as productive, because they want a profit and they want actual growth in their actual business. If we look at how we have private security firms on how they work, they started a few people and they can develop into a huge corporation next to the government, in which when we see that they work, We look at TSA, for instance, and we see the TSA is the best that they've done is even as much money as we've pumped in is an 80% failure rate. And this is what non-productive spending gets us. And this is what you get is an 80% failure rate, and they've been guilty of theft and improper screening where they're basically grabbing people, and this is what you're getting from people. Now, if you actually hand that over to the airlines will actually hire independent security firms, and those independent security firms or actually hire security personnel themselves and screen them themselves, and they actually have an incentive because they're an actual airline company to actually have people that will work in their best interest. Now, their interest is to make sure that people fly safely. Now, the government doesn't have an interest in that. Government only has the interest in giving the illusion of safety. The airline actually has a vested interest in this because it affects their stock, it affects their profit. And this is the whole thing with them. They understand when a plane crashes, or if a plane has it from any type of security risk, they understand, even if it's not a security risk, they understand that impacts their actual ability to gain money and to drive a profit. And when you can't gain profit, that hurts a lot of people in your system. And this is this is what we would feel as an actual problem. And what they would actually feel is a problem for their system. And this is and what they would do is ensure that they're getting the best security for their planes. Now, if you this is why you get a huge difference in the way the government treats it as public spending next to private spending. And that's why what ends up happening is you're going to get a massive difference. And it's just what ends up happening, because it's just that's how productive spending goes. And when we look at what Austrians would actually view, Austrians want to essentially get as least amount of non-productive spending out there possibly, which means to reduce the government spending down to a minimum possible, because they view this non-productive spending as troublesome. And as opposed to MMT, which would essentially view it in a different light of saying that they want as much government spending and as least private spending as possible, which comes from totally different lights. Now, I've been called, from being Austrian economic supporter, I've been called basically capitalist. I've been called buying into capitalist propaganda and all these other stupid little things from that. Because when it comes to MMT, people want to believe in this fairy tale, and they don't want to believe because it doesn't even fit into reality. It's because it doesn't. It only believes it believes the government is the creator of money. Well, to believe this, you have to ignore history, number one. And they said, I've also been accused of basically saying I should get a refund for my education. because I didn't what it call it totally embrace MMT. Now, because they had this pie in the sky view of MMT, and MMT is basically it's the only form they would embrace Marxism, in which it would have a positive view of Marxism, and it's the only way in which it would work. Now, the only ones that actually have supported it have been a couple of people. Not even it has not even been popular amongst the Democratic Party, and this should be a little bit of a key. Even amongst the people running as president, we have not seen even one person uh, support it. Even on the site in which I was discussing this, which is for one of the Democratic nominees, even that Democratic nominee does not support it herself, which is actually quite odd that we would have people that would support it. And that should give you a little bit of a key that we do not see. That we only see a few people in Congress that actually support it. I mean, we're talking like less than like 1%, and that's because it's such an extreme school of thought that it doesn't even make any sense, and it's because it would never even come into play when it comes down to anything legitimate. It's not even considered even in any of the close to mainstream schools of thought, and it's because it ignores everything. It ignores even what traditionally what the Marxist systems of the 20th century used, which was the Keynesian economics model. It pretty much throws that on its head, and even Austrians are basically surprised that they would even go as people would go as far as to believe this, because this is going completely in the opposite direction. And when people proclaim that this is going off human nature, this is not even going off human nature. This is merely just basically taking a full turn into central planning, and that's really what it's doing, because all you're doing is you're merely shifting everything into the public arena, which is not which is not going into human nature. You're actually going away from human nature. So when people proclaim that they're going into human nature, like the Austrian school is, they're actually completely lying when it comes to that. And that was the that was the whole point that they tend to get across with it, which is they try to what they want to do is they want to bring up these positive points that tend to be associated with Austrian economics, because they want to be viewed in that light, but they don't. And this is so they tend to steal those points, and they want to basically end up wanting to steal those. What they'll end up doing is stealing a lot of those talking points of Austrian economics, but when it comes down to everything, they don't want to realize what their system really is, and most of the supporters I don't think are that bright to begin with, and because when we deal with it, it's basically just shifting. It's shifting. Their system is merely just shifting everything uh, from private spending over to public spending, and that's merely what it's doing. And we're obviously aware of what public spending does, and it's completely non-productive. And if we look at the history of the Marxist systems, it pretty much we know what they produced, and they couldn't produce anything worthwhile. If we look at the history of their products, beyond some internal components, and for one, and number two was like one vehicle, which was the VW Beetle. Uh, we're talking nothing else was actually productive, and that should be a little bit of a key of what was productive during in those from the that actual point, and that should be kind of a little bit of a key to what end up coming out of those physical areas. And we know that nothing else could come out of those areas. And that's basically it. And those physical components actually were from the military, and those were actually developed for the military, and those actually came out many years later when these places folded. And there were actually a lot of individuals sold them. And these are for resistors, capacitors, things like those, uh, audio tubes, and the like. And that's about it. And that's basically what they end up producing. But those were actually military equipment, because that was basically what their main focus was. Because when we have this, we have that as their main goal. And when we have the government being the sole system for production, basically there's not going to be much positive production in the system, because there's not going to be any way to ensure it's going to be higher quality. And we know what ends up happening. I mean, out in the Soviet Union, they end up having a whole managerial system just to make sure supplies were delivered. And this was and that was along the supply chain, and that was just basically to ensure that just supplies were delivered. And this would have and this is really what happens when you have more and more shifts to the government spending system, is because there isn't the urgency then from people. They just go, well, I can wait, and they'll end up saying, well, I'll wait on sending the shipment out. And because there's no difference in anything, so they're not going to be urgent on sending anything out, and there's no difference. They can't be fired because it's guaranteed jobs. And that's really what MMT ends up embracing, because it usually gets linked with programs such as the Green New Deal, which is these guaranteed jobs from the government. And when we start to talk about that, you'll see that you'll see that basically this is why we end up talking about this idea of productive versus non-productive spending. It's not going to be productive spending when it goes toward the government, and this is why governments that slide to more public spending end up starting to falter. The more public spending you have, the worse off the economy is. And if we start to look at where our government is spending a great deal of public spending right now, we can actually see that our economy is not doing that well, and it's haltered by a lot of this government spending, and has been for the last about couple of decades. And when we see this, we need to realize that this is what ends up causing these things. Now, what the way to adjust this is you need to start turning back the clock on these things and start reducing government spending, because the more private business you have, uh, the more productive the economy is going to be, and you want less and less of control of the government doing it, because what that's going to do is that's going to make sure that the actual economy is productive. Because when the government has more and more control over it, it becomes this top-down thing, and it just ends up coming to a screeching halt and eventually collapses, because we end up seeing how fast and this is under the Keynesian system, but how fast the system of Venezuela came to a collapse. Because I mean, if you look at you look at when Hugo Chavez, you can take a look at Venezuela when Hugo Chavez took the thing that was in '99. Or no, sorry. Let's see. Let's see when he was president. Yeah, he was in office from '99 to 2002. Let's see. Yeah. But it wasn't until 2007 that he, or no, that has flipped the Socialist Party. So he was already socialist before. So that would basically, so he's always been socialist. So basically, from '99 to from '99 on with it. So basically, within a matter of essentially 2 decades, within a matter of basically, we're talking roughly about 20 years under essentially what we would view as non productive spending, that their whole system, but under Keynesian economics, not MMT, but Keynesian economics, the system of Venezuela has come to a screeching halt. And even though they've been somewhat impacted by uh, even though they've been somewhat impacted by uh, yeah, even though they've been somewhat impacted uh, by different sanctions and such. It's what it called. It still has been a point that it shows right there. Now they actually have the benefit of per person of having a great number of having a greater number of resources per person than the United States has, because of how oil rich they are next to how many citizens they have. And this is something that it really should show that's what is going on there. And this should bring up a very important point, that what would happen in the United States that doesn't have as much of these resources per person, and especially because we are not as productive of a nation as we really should be, because we've let too much stuff slide to the government. And when we view them with it, we should view them, even though it's not MMT, it's still Keynesian. We should view them kind of in the same way as an MMT system, because of what they've done in sliding everything over. And that should be something very important in why we should never look to them. And we should view it in such a way that's very destructive. And we should end up understanding that we should want to go toward things that are actually creating more wealth and more individual liberty, which is going to happen under the Austrian system. We should want to go away from that, which is going to be happening from more productive spending and more voluntary entrepreneurship. And this is only going to happen when you deal with getting away from this idea of central banking. And it doesn't matter how much people want to state that their system uh, works with human nature. It doesn't. Once you go to central banking, it's totally negated human nature, and they can copy all of the talking points of the Austrian model, but if it doesn't fit, then you can't state that it's anything similar, because frankly, when it comes down to it, is there is nothing with human nature when it comes to MMT. It's basically it's dealing with a fully centralized system, and that's really what you're dealing with here now, because that's the only way it works. Because when they're dealing with counting with stating that debts, when they use the term debts don't matter, they're actually counting private savings, and they split savings with investment as well. That means they're essentially claiming ownership of that money, which means that this can only happen with two ways. Either A, they're what it called, they're using tactics in which they're lying on the accounting, a la Arthur Anderson, or B, what they're doing is they're actually creating a system in which they're claiming that they own that property. And this would be in the same light of one trying to claim on their taxes that all the children in the neighborhood are their dependents. Meanwhile, that would not be legitimate, and that because that would essentially be going down as theft, and we know this to be true. And that's the whole point. Now, that's essentially what MMT is doing to validate why debts don't matter. Now, this is, and when they start to develop into the idea of this supporting public spending, is they think that they can, is they view it as something good. Well, we know it as non-productive spending because there is not going to be the same incentives as productive and private spending. And what they're doing is they're essentially their goals are essentially to slide everything over. And what the end goal is going to be is basically that is to teach that government is actually good, and and uh, and it's basically trying to teach this idea that government spending is something positive. And I end up getting what it called these comments from people that are MMT advocates, and they think MMT is great. I got another one saying what it calls saying how great MMT is, and basically with it they don't understand what MMT really is. With it, even themselves don't understand what MMT is. They don't understand MMT relies it has to by default be central banking. If we go with one of them with it, it's basically he he doesn't understand that MMT relies solely on central banking, and it can't do anything otherwise. And he actually does not understand that, and that this is a point that's and he thinks that he thinks it deals with the ideas of human nature. Well, you can't from central banking because you're only having a handful of people make the decisions. You're not having the whole market, and if you discount actual capitalism, which he does, he's against capitalism, which if you discount capitalism, it means you hate the marketplace, which means that you actually don't trust the actual market, which means you're against human nature. So by default, you cannot trust you're not trusting human nature, which means his actual points would actually be erroneous. And that's the whole point. And that's where we get at, and that's what needs to be understood. And if we're going to go into that, is you cannot say your system believes in human nature and yet be against the market. The market is what actually decides human nature, and that because you're dealing with it's humans dealing with one another in a voluntary system. And if you don't believe in capitalism, then you're essentially throwing that out, and that's what you end up having. And if you want a centrally planned system, that centrally planned system is not human nature. You're throwing that out. And that's what's and you're basically advocating for what would be Marxism. And that's really what MMT is really designed to do. And that's why when it comes down to things, it views spending when it comes down to government or non-productive spending as being beneficial. But when we look at history, we know that non-productive spending makes things worse, and you're taking money away from what could be productive spending. And every event, when it comes down to it, it shows when you start taking away money from that, you're basically going to hurt the economy itself. The more money you take away from that, the worse the economy gets. This is why the more money you end up pulling away from taxation for other programs means the worse the economy ends up getting. This is just logic, and this is what has actually been proven over the history of the world. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. You could say, "Oh, but we're doing all these other programs in our government and blah 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 blah." It doesn't matter. Even if you're repeating the exact same thing that the private market was going to do, it shows when we deal with the productive spending next to non-productive spending, it shows that the way things turn out. Because the actual growth of what actually happens and the development of what happens on the productive spending from the entrepreneurs is going to be a completely different outcome of what the non-productive spending from government and public sources was going to be. And the outlook was going to be different because they don't look at government and public spending doesn't look at the negative outcomes of just spending money whatever comes in. They don't consider that as anything negative. They won't look at okay, we only need so many people for a job. They don't look at any of these factors. They don't look at what do we need to grow. They don't look at the economic situations. They don't look at what's the best thing for the company. They don't look at any of the data. Because there is no points of oh, we can go under, we can actually negative situations can cause our business to go under. They don't look at these things, and that's the whole point. And people need to understand this, and this is why MMT is a complete and utter failure. And if you think that government spending is positive, you're kind of really not the brightest brick in the wall. And it's really kind of sad that you haven't been able to grasp the ideas of history that actually have been out there for quite some time. That if you actually open up a history book, you would understand, number one, is money, the idea of money actually predates government. Government is a newer idea than money. That's number one. So that kind of defeats the whole thing. because if which means the government is not the owner nor the creator of money. That really puts a huge damper in the idea of MMT. That means that means they are not the owners nor creators of money, and it would make sense with the actual international currency market, because if they were, then there wouldn't be an international currency market if this were the case. And another one is that they is on the idea of how money is spent wisely with it. People have actually shown that when we get government spending money, it just doesn't get spent wisely, even on the same projects. If you get you'll see areas in which government will try to spend money on like when people say, oh, but if the government doesn't do the roads, who will? Well, the fact is you don't find politicians out there shoveling the roads. They're actually hiring companies. If the actual people directly through what it called voluntarily put together some money, each doing a little bit per street area, they could actually come together and actually pay for their own streets. They don't need the government to come in, tax the hell out of them, basically have some bureaucrats decide, okay, when are we going to do this? How much money are we going to take from people? What are we going to advocate from this area with it? How much money are we going to put towards this, and this, and this, and this, and this? And then basically, and then decide, okay, maybe we're not going to do infrastructure this year. And they're not going, and then essentially take away a lot of money from these communities. And then, oh, we want more money for war. And no, they would go, no, if we actually we would realize that we don't need as much money put into government. Now, MMT goes the opposite direction and says, no, we need a lot more money put into government because we need all these government jobs. Well, we already had a guy out in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s that actually came up with this idea. This is the guy that they use as their that a lot of people use as the default insults when trying to shut off a conversation between someone that they lose an argument to, and that would be Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler already did all this stuff, and the fact is he guaranteed jobs. He was guaranteed health care, guaranteed daycare, was talking about all of this stuff, and the fact is he had the government taking care of all of these things. Well, the fact is he knew that the government was going to run out of money. The way you do it is you take other people's stuff, and that was the idea. And he started off with taking the Jews' stuff and other political dissident stuff, and then he went on to other countries, taking their stuff. And he realized this was a way of basically making sure that they could economically support their system. And this is essentially what MMT survives on, taking people's stuff. Now, they do it through, MMT does it through a lot through taxation. It's still going to do it through loans as well. And it's going to do a lot through inflation. Most of it's going to be happening through inflation because it wants to run a lot of government contracts. It's going to print like nobody's seen before. And its validation for it is going to say it has ownership of all of the private equity, and it's going to claim ownership to all the private equity. regardless if it has legitimate claims to it or not. And you're going to see the same type of reaction when they try to steal that stuff, as they did in Venezuela, and where people built up these businesses from scratch, and they steal the stuff, and that's basically what ends up happening. And that's what their whole system is built on. And this is why when we talk about productive spending and non-productive spending, it's a very, very important argument. And people need to understand that there's a lot of different points between these whole things of productive and non-productive spending that really show differences between all of the different systems of government that we could go towards. And or all the systems of economics that we can go towards. And this is a whole big problem that a lot of people are not the brightest when dealing with. And they just automatically assume that, oh, we can and they can just automatically assume on what they are on what they are on what they are dealing with, on the whole thing from the economy. Now I'm probably just gonna end it right here, and I will see you guys later today. Hopefully we don't have to go over this whole idea again, because it doesn't seem like they learn anything. They seem to be as dumb as a box of rocks, because they're more concerned about making sure that their policies go through than actually learning something. So hopefully we can just cut it right here and do that. Now, if you like it, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure you share it all the way around. Make sure you check out my Patreon page, and that's about it. If you can't donate, make sure you share with someone who can, and we're gonna cut it right there, and that's it. And see you guys later.